Remember that the situation we are considering here is one where there's two goods that the consumer could consume. So a bundle, A, specifies the quantity of good 1 that the consumer consumes, Q1, and the quantity of good 2 that the consumer consumes. In other words, a bundle specifies the quantities of both of the goods that the consumer would consume. Now consider two different bundles, bundle A and bundle B. Bundle A has 1 of the first good and 2 of the second good, but bundle B has them reversed, 2 of the first good, 1 of the second good. How does the consumer compare these two bundles? Well, their preferences tell us how they can compare the two bundles. So our model begins with the assumption that every consumer has well-defined preferences. Where do those preferences come from? We're not going to try and analyze that. We're going to take as a starting point those preferences. Now, different people could be different. Some people might prefer bundle A, some people might prefer bundle B. So the goods and the preferences are what we call primitives of the model. So they're sort of the starting point. So take two bundles A and B. I'm going to describe some notation that we'll use. If the consumer thinks A is at least as good as B, then we're going to use this symbol here. Right? Now this looks a little bit like the greater than or equal to symbol. And that's not an accident. Right? So we're going to use this symbol to mean that A is in the preferences of this consumer at least as good as bundle B. So you would read this to say that the consumer finds A to be at least as good as bundle B. So like I said, you want to think of this quite a bit like you think of the greater than or equal to sign. Now, can you have that A is at least as good as B and B is at least as good as A? Of course you can. Right? Sometimes economists use this somewhat odd-sounding language, weakly preferred. It sounds strange to say that, but what it means is that A is at least as good as B and B is at least as good as A. What that means is that the consumer finds them to be equally good. Right? So this means that the consumer is indifferent between the two bundles. So he's equally happy consuming the bundle 2-1 and the bundle 1-2. Or going back to the example that we introduced earlier, if this good 1 were pizza and good 2 were beer, this would be saying that he's equally happy consuming 2 pizzas and 1 beer, or 1 pizza and 2 beers. We'll write this indifference symbol using this tilde. Note that A and B being indifferent does not mean that they're exactly the same bundle. It just means that the consumer is indifferent between them. Right? So here we have these two different bundles, 2-1 and 1-2. They contain different, they're composed of different goods, yet the consumer could be indifferent between them. What if A is at least as good as B, but B is not at least as good as A? So this is spelled out here. Right? Here I've used the notation. This is in notation. And this is just in plain English. But they mean the same thing. A is at least as good as B is what this says, but B is not at least as good as A. Well, that means that A has to be better than B. And we use this notation. Right? Again, think of it similar to the greater than sign. So A is something that the consumer thinks is a better bundle than B. So we say that the consumer prefers B. And here we would use the word strictly sometimes. You'll see economists use the word strictly. So that's, if you go back and compare with the terminology, A is weakly preferred to B versus strictly preferred to be, it's a distinction between something that's better than or at least as good as. So like I said, you want to think of this symbol much the way you think of greater than.